military personnel member or government employee, then you can be exempted from that requirement. And in certain cases, people who've gone abroad for missionary work can be exempted as well. It's not very likely to come up, except that you might run into a veteran who's recently come back. Most veterans, however, now there's a whole program to help military personnel naturalize while they're on active duty. And so most of them will have taken advantage of that while they're on duty, rather than waiting until they're released. So you probably aren't likely to encounter that. But if somebody was abroad for government employment, military, or as the spouse of somebody who was abroad for military or government employment or missionary work, there may be an exemption. Any questions about the physical presence requirement? It's just straight math. How many days were you inside? How many days were you outside the United States in total during the 5-year period or the 3-year period if you're the spouse of a citizen? During that period, they also look at your residence, and the way that they define residence is that basically they're looking at where you kept your permanent home. So if you were out of the country for less than half of that 5-year period, but you were absent for a big chunk, all in one piece. So let's say I was gone for 18 months in one trip during that 5-year period, I would have a problem because there's a break in the continuity of my residence. So what they prefer to see is that no single trip was 6 months. If everything's under 6 months, and in total you have at least 50% of your time inside the United States, then you'll be okay. If you have the 50% inside the US met, but you had a trip that was between 6 months and a year, then, well, not a full year, but between 6 months and almost 1 year, then they will examine the reasons for your trip. Okay? Were you abroad and then an emergency came up, like you got hit by a car and you were in the hospital, or your family member became terribly ill and you had to go take care of them? Were you abroad for a known period of time which had a clear ending point? So two opposite situations: the emergency that took you abroad longer than you had intended, or the clear plan to be abroad for less than 1 year. For example, I went to study abroad for 2 semesters and now I'm coming back. Okay, so in that instance, because I am enrolled in a program that specifically had a 9-month running time, and it was clear that I was firmly here in my US home before leaving, and I'm clearly coming back to continue my education, then that could be excused, okay? Because it wasn't this sort of open-ended, oh, I'm moving to Indonesia. Okay? If I went to the University of Jakarta for 2 semesters in a study abroad program, it's clear that I wasn't moving to Indonesia long-term. It had a fixed ending point. The same thing if I have a limited term employment contract to go and work in another country, particularly if it's for a US-based company. If my semiconductor company sends me abroad to Taiwan to help them retool the factory over there, and it's a limited term assignment and I'm coming back here at the end, that would probably be okay as well. But if you're gone for between 6 months and 12 months, they presume that you've broken the continuity of your residence, and it's up to you to prove that you didn't break it by showing your ties to the United States. Okay, so if you kept your cell phone account, if you kept your car registered, if you paid up your car insurance, if your family members, like if you have a spouse and kids, if they remained here in the US while you were abroad, you have a good chance of showing them that you didn't abandon your residence here in the United States during that period. But if you're gone 1 full year, then they won't look at any of that at all. If you're gone a full year, the only exceptions are similar to the ones I mentioned for physical presence, which is military service, certain religious work, and certain employment by US government or certain US-based companies. So hopefully that won't come up because it gets really sticky exactly whether somebody's qualified for an exemption. But the general rule, if you see a full year absence in a single trip, that person very likely has a problem. If it's between 6 months and a year, then they will look at the reasons and they may well be persuaded that you didn't abandon your residence here, especially again if you had access to a home here, you kept your car registered, kept your cell phone on, kept your bank accounts active, paid taxes on any income you had for that year. That would be really important and something that they look at. And where was your family? Was the whole family over there? Did it look like you were moving there and then suddenly changed your mind and moved back? Or was it clearly always going to be a temporary absence? Any questions about that? Okay. Now, if you do have an absence of a whole year or an absence of 6 months to a year without a good reason, then it resets the clock. So it resets it, it sounds funny at first, you have to wait 4 years and 1 day. If you're using the spouse of a citizen rule, you have to wait 2 years and 1 day from the time you return from your trip that was too long. And the reason for that is that after 4 years and 1 day, or 2 years and 1 day, in the period that they're looking at, you no longer have a trip that was a whole year. They chewed off the very end of it, right? So if I was gone for 18 months and I wait 4 years and 1 day from the time I come back, then in that period, the very beginning of that period, I was gone the first 364 days. And that they can excuse if I'm willing to wait that long. Otherwise, I can't be excused because I had that 18-month trip, provided I wasn't, missionary or U.S. soldier and so on. So if you see somebody who had a trip that was too long, and it was either over a year, or it was between 6 and 12 months, and you don't think they have enough documents to show that they really firmly kept their home here while they were away during that, say, 9-month trip, then you need to advise them that it would be best, in most cases, to wait 4 years and 1 day from the return from that trip. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't leave the country during that time. You can take short trips, but nothing, again, nothing 6 months or more. So if I was gone for this very long trip, and I'm going to wait 4 years and 1 day, I can take shorter trips as long as my 50% of my time is spent inside the U.S. Okay, so as long as I meet that 50% rule, and in that 4 years and 1 day after returning from my long trip, I only have shorter trips that are under 6 months, then I'll be all right. Okay? You can see how nitpicky this stuff is. Does anybody have any questions about that? Yes?
Well, if you wait the 4 years and 1 day and you take the short little less than 6 months trip, do they still count the 364 days in that 50%?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. They're literally looking at the whole 5 years before you apply.
Okay.
Or for the spouse, the whole 3 years before you apply. So they do